10th reason why I believe we're about to enter a golden age is that scholars are beginning, emphasize beginning, to recognize that Jesus Christ never existed. Now, common sense tells us that the stories about him are ridiculous. But the popular thing among scholars who don't know about the documents, the fact that you're so-called a scholar doesn't mean you really know anything. The view among them is, well, yeah, he existed. He might not have been God, but he certainly existed. That's the consensus. Well, that's beginning to change. I put on the bottom of my card, don't rattle on, because this is a subject that really gets me going. So I'll try to keep this brief. There's no evidence at all, that there was ever a man in the Middle East, Jesus Christ. There's no evidence of his birth. There's no evidence of his life. There's no evidence of his death. Even the early Christian writers, like the Pauline epistles, by which I mean the letters that Paul wrote to the different churches, Thessalonica and Galatians and so forth, Paul never mentions anything about an earthly Jesus. If you've seen this wonderful documentary, The God Who Wasn't There, Brian Fleming, thank you. You are a hero of mine. Thank you. For those of you who haven't seen that, it shows in very great detail why we can say with pretty much certainty that there was never any such person. Paul, even though he was a Christian and believed in a Son of God in heaven, Jesus was in heaven, and all the Pauline epistles, which is half of the New Testament, Paul never mentions anything about Mary and Joseph, about the virgin birth, about the wise men, about Bethlehem, about the star, about Herod, that supposedly slaughtered all of the children, which, you'd think you might make note of that. Paul makes no mention at all of anything having to do with the earthly life of Jesus. Paul does not quote one word Jesus said. Again, Paul does not quote one word that Jesus said. Some will take exception to that. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians 15 about the Last Supper, which, if you want to email me, I'll talk about that. There's no mention in any of the Pauline epistles about any miracles Jesus did. There's nothing about Calvary. There's nothing about a resurrection. And so even among the Christian writers of the first century, there's no mention of any earthly Jesus. Now, if I thought somebody had been crucified and rose from the dead, I'd want to go there. I'd want to say, is this the tomb? Is this Calvary? Is this where this happened? I mean, there would have been people coming, walking for hundreds of miles to see these places, to talk about them. It would have been on the tips of everyone's tongue. Everything you wrote about would have been about this. Yet in the first century, there's not one reference, even among the Christians, to Calvary, to the empty tomb, to Pilate, in the connection with Jesus. We know that Pilate existed for other reasons. But Paul believed in a Jesus that lived in heaven. And the scholars are starting to recognize that there's no evidence. I mean, if you want to show me some evidence or other people, I'll be happy to read it. But the burden is on you. The burden is on you, those who believe. And then shortly before 100 A.D., someone, I don't know who it was, and you don't know who it was, Christians who might be watching this video, wrote the book of Mark, which took the idea of a Son of God in heaven and tried to make it a little more practical. Let's put it in time and space. This Jesus that we have worshipped for centuries before 1 AD or 5 BC or whenever you think Jesus might have been born, there was a long tradition, a very long tradition. Robert Price is talking about it. Earl Dougherty, read Earl Dougherty's book. People had worshipped a Son of God in heaven for centuries. But about 100 years, about 100 AD, someone, for reasons I don't know, maybe just as a creative writer or to teach a moral lesson or to play mischief, he combined this Son of God in heaven belief, which was very widespread, with the idea that we're going to put this in time and space. We're going to say he was born in Jerusalem, since we live in Jerusalem. And so the book of Mark was written. And it's very basic. Matthew was the next book written. And it gets a little more flowery. It writes what Mark says. But it adds to it. For example, that when Jesus was crucified, that there were corpses from cemeteries in Jerusalem that were walking around the streets. Now, if there were corpses that came out of the grave from cemeteries in Columbus and were walking up and down Broad Street and High Street, don't you think somebody might mention that? It is not possible. It is not possible that something like that could have occurred and nobody mentioned it. But of the secular sources who were alive at the time, and even the Pauline epistles, which are part of the canonical scripture, make no reference to that at all. So, first was Mark, then Matthew, and then Luke was third. By the way, the books, in case you didn't know, were not written in the order that they appeared. The Pauline epistles were first, then Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. And Luke also had access to Mark and made up his own bullshit about where were the post-resurrection appearances. They don't agree with Matthew. And then John is so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that it's not even called one of the synoptic gospels. The synoptic gospels are the first three. John is very much different. But it was not until about 100 years after Jesus was supposedly born that anybody said anything about it. He was born in Bethlehem. There was a star. So if all these things had really occurred, we would have an unlimited number of documents to attest this. This absolute silence during this period says to me that that never happened. It never happened. And I didn't follow my script because I did rattle on. Okay.